Hello everybody and welcome to Chop and Brew. I am Chip Walton. In this episode of Chop and Brew, a homebrew history lesson of epic proportions. This past summer, I went to Homebrewing 2016 in Baltimore, Maryland, where as part of my duties and responsibilities on your American Homebrewers Association Governing Committee, I get to introduce homebrewers, craft brewers, and other beer-minded folk as they launch into their presentations and seminars. This year, a true honor, I got to set up the one and only Charlie Papazian, a man who really needs no introduction in the homebrew circle, but I did the best I could. Charlie's presentation is called Homebrewing History, a Photographic Tour with Charlie. It's a slideshow with images and stories that he's gathered over his 4 decades of homebrewing. What you're about to hear and see is nothing short of essential knowledge for anyone who considers homebrewing and craft beer cornerstones to their life's obsession with beer. Here, we not only learn about the roots of such groups and events as the AHA, the NHC, Homebrewing, and the BJCP, but also the foundation of raw material availability, innovation in equipment, and evolution in brewing recipes and methods. I found this photographic history very inspiring, both at the presentation and as I've been editing it the last couple of days. Just so many things to note, so many great people who paved the way for our hobby. Huge credit where credit is due. Big shout out to Charlie Papazian, Brewers Association, American Homebrewers Association, for letting us borrow these photographs and kind of tell this story, share this presentation with homebrewers all over the world. One quick note, Homebrewing 2017 is coming to the backyard of Chop and Brew. That's right, Minneapolis, St. Paul, June 15th through 17th. The Chop and Brew crew has already had a couple of meetings getting together. We're trying to figure out what to do for fans traveling near and far, for club night, for maybe some extracurricular meetups. The local committee is already hammering away on making it the best Homebrewing ever. So if you've never been to a Homebrewing, make this your first. It's going to be a blast. We're going to set the bar very high. If you've been to a Homebrewing, especially the one that was in Minneapolis in 2010, come back. The city is a whole different place, both as far as homebrewing, but craft brewing has just blown up in those 5 years. Beer Fest going to kick off the weeks. It's just going to be nuts. So come back. All right. So as the man Charlie P himself would say, let's cut with the shuck and jive and get on with it. Grab yourself a big glass of something. This episode is about an hour long. So cheers. Relax. Don't worry. Have a homebrew.
Great to be here. I want to make one thing clear. A lot of people have been mentioned, say congratulations on your retirement. I'm not retired by any stretch of the imagination at this point. I got lots to do and lots of stuff that I'm looking forward to do. And a couple of those projects that I'm working on right now, which this presentation evolved out of one of those projects, of archiving all the photographs I can get my hands on, and all the negatives that never have seen the lights of day. And I've digitalized over 30,000 black and white image and color images, and I probably have another 30 or 40,000 to go. It's a long-range project. So that's one part of the project. The other project is I'm interviewing the pioneers of craft brewing. There's about 100 people that are on my list that I am doing 50-minute video interviews with, the people who started the professional end, the microbrewing end, the craft brewing end, from a professional standpoint. And I've learned so much. And going through all these photographs, I also have really realized, I knew it, but it really came to light that we have so much to celebrate, not only in our current state of home brewing and beer in the United States and the future, as we all look forward to it, but also we have lots of things to celebrate about our past. And that's what this presentation is a little bit about. Now, I have to mention that there are people that are often referred to as pioneers, but one of the aspects of being a pioneer is that some of those early pioneers were not really pioneers. In the early days of modern home brewing, there was a whole bunch of people that were more explorers than pioneers. When you go into the jungle as a pioneer, you have a map. Someone's been there before you. You know, you're kind of there for a known purpose. But the explorers, many of us, were going into this homebrewing hobby without knowledge of what we were going to find, because there was not much information out there to discover. We had to recreate the history and the past of what our beer and brewing culture was not only in the United States but worldwide. There was very little information. So we were kind of scratching the surface and trying, helping each other out, getting it all together to come to the state of affairs that we're at right now. So I have about 140 slides, and I'm going to go through them quickly. There's a number of people that I'm going to highlight. I'm obviously going to overlook some people. You know, I'm human. I went through a whole bunch of slides. I went through all that Homebrewers Conference slides from 1979 through about 1990, and I tried to pick out primarily homebrewers that really were the explorers and the pioneers that kind of laid out the foundation of where we're at now. And there are also a few non-homebrewers that have contributed to the homebrewers so much that I wanted to give a shout out to them. So this is organized by two segments, 1979 to 1981. And then I have another section of slides or pictures from 1982 to 1990. So here we go. Enjoy. Al Andrews, member of the Maltose Falcons. I don't expect that many people here know who he was, but he was, in that day and age, 1981, I believe, is the first time I met him. He was, and he came to a conference, one of our conferences. He came to many conferences. He was Homebrew's Mr. Wizard. You couldn't buy equipment, homebrew equipment, except plastic fermenters, wooden spoons, and Corona grain mills. And he was fashioning temperature-controlled wort chillers, fermentation, temperature-controlled fermentation. He was making grain mills out of grocery store machinery, that, you know, to check out the rollers that, you know, or the belts. He was fashioning grain crushers out of whatever he could find that he figured he'd work. But he contributed a whole lot of mechanical information, engineering information to the homebrewing community. Roger Brees, he wasn't a homebrewer, but he owned Brees Malting. And in 1982 and 1983 and many conferences thereafter, he was a fixture at those conferences because he wanted to make malt, particularly his malt, but no other malt company. I mean, no other malt company really was interested in connecting with the homebrew movement at that time. And he would come to our conferences, and he was a brewmaster, and he was a maltster, and he contributed his information at those early events. He judged homebrew competitions, made suggestions about improving the quality of our beers, and was instrumental. He was exhibiting, just like at the trade show here, he exhibited at the early trade shows of the homebrewers and the microbrewers and craft brewers. He was instrumental. He was the first malt company to come to our events. And he joined in the fun. Certainly joined in the fun. He loved beer. And he passed away too early, but we are indebted to his contributions to the industry. Here's someone most of you recognize, should recognize. If you don't, it's Byron Birch. He passed away last year. He has contributed not only through his homebrew knowledge and sharing of his information, but he had a homebrew shop originally called Great Fermentations. It took other names after that. But he and Jay Connors had that shop, Great Fermentations. But what Byron Birch did, one of the things that, innovative things that he did was he figured out what hops were all about and came up with this novel idea of packaging hops in vacuum bags and oxygen barrier plastic bags. So that was the first time fresh hops, there was a means to get fresh hops to homebrewer. His homebrew shop came up with that idea, and obviously the industry, the whole beer industry, has copied what he initially came up with. He was Homebrewer of the Year 1986. He was Home Mead Maker of the Year 1992, 1994, and 2001. So he was not only at the beer, but mead. And he shared his information, proof that he was into it. His homebrew club, Sonoma Bureaucrats, which he was an integral part of, took Homebrew Club of the Year 10 years in a row. 10 years in a row. And that was a phenomenal achievement. So we miss Byron, for sure. It wouldn't be complete unless we mentioned then his wife, Nancy Vineyard, who also won Homebrewer of the Year in 1983 and was a partner in the Great Fermentation endeavor. So she was one of those early pioneers and explorers that were really contributing to what we now have. Here's a shout out to John Kennedy. If you lived in Boulder, Colorado, he and his wife Lois Kennedy, volunteered in the early days of the American Homebrewers Association, editorially and also writing. Colonel John had a country wines column in the early days of the American Homebrewers Association, Zymergy magazine, but also when in Boulder, Colorado, where there was a core group of homebrewers that really volunteered and contributed to making the AHA work and evolve. He opened up, when there was no homebrew shop in Boulder, he opened up his house and sold supplies from his house. And he got a lot of shit for that because that's not the way the retailers really wanted that there. But there was no other choice, and he persisted. And going to his house and buying homebrew supplies was not just an ordinary experience, to say the least. I mean, there were active fermentations and other byproducts of fermentations. I won't say whether they were legal or not, but that you could experience. So people always came in, whatever mood they came in, they came out from that the buying spree pretty happily. But Lois was one of our original editors, and they contributed so much to the success of the Homebrewers Association. That guy, that gentleman there, a side note, that's Lois, but the other guy is Bill Litzinger. He wrote one of the original stories in Zymergy in the very early days about the indigenous beers of Central America, the Indian beers, the beers that the Indians in Central America were doing. He was a professor at University of Colorado, I believe, and he was real, just as you heard perhaps some of you, Dr. McGovern talk about, what his research. There were people doing this stuff back in the early 80s as well, and they had no other place to. Not many people were excited about what they were doing, but homebrewers were. We were hungry for all kinds of information. Another person I want to mention is Kathy McClurg. I've known her for 43 years, and she was the original editor and continued to be an editor for Zymergy for at least 20 years before she retired doing that. The interesting thing about Kathy, when we first came out with the original issue, volume 1, number 1 issue of Zymergy magazine, the front page story was a story called The Lost Art of Homebrewing. The Lost Art of Homebrewing was a magazine article that was published in 1930s in a magazine called Mercury News. That was her father. And so that was the beginning. That was our beginnings based on her father, the front page, original, one of the headline stories that we had. Jay Connor, I mentioned him a little bit earlier, was a partner with Byron Birch, and his contributions, not only as a home brewer and an enthusiast, but also as a shop owner with Byron, and the contributions that Great Fermentation made to the entire industry by coming to these conferences and sharing their information and what was going on in California was invaluable. There he is sharing part of the glory of, I think, Nancy Vineyard's Homebrewer of the Year award there in the early days. That's Aylford. Aylford was our mascot. As you know, the turkey is the the bird that Benjamin Franklin wanted as the American mascot, but the eagle became the mascot, so we took the turkey as homebrewers. Fred Eckhart, all of you should know, you should know who Fred Eckhart is. He passed away recently as well. I first met him in 1981 when he came to Boulder. I was in awe of what Fred had done. He had publications, The Amateur Brewery. He wrote a book called The Essentials of Beer Styles, way before anybody else had even thought about beer styles. He also was really into sake, the art of sake, and also published a book called Sake. He gave many presentations at our conferences. He also gave us the perspective to use our ears when we're evaluating beers. And I took that pretty seriously. You can actually assess some of the qualities of beers by listening to your beer. Mm-hmm. You have to be quiet, but you can listen to your beer and assess, whether that it helps you assess whether that beer has good qualities. Here's a picture of Fred, a rare picture of Fred with a necktie on. But he, one of the things that Fred brought to the home brewing community was a real spirit of fun and enjoyment. He constantly reminded us that let's not take this too seriously. I also want to mention his book, Treatise of Lager Beer. It was the first homebrew book that really touched upon the whole idea of homebrewing lager beers. Because in those early days, almost all the other literature was about brewing ales. So he was not only a pioneer, he was an explorer, and he came to many conferences to share information. Charlie Finkel from Seattle, Washington. He's not a home brewer. He owns the Pike Brewing Company and Brew Pub in Seattle, Washington, and Pike Place Market. But originally, his original business, he was in the wine business, and then he was importing wine. He also began to import beer and wine, and it was through the few beers that he imported in the early 1980s and mid to late 1970s that many of us homebrewers were introduced to beers such as Gueuze and Lambic and organic beer and Dortmund. He was specializing in specialty beers, a handful of specialty beers, to introduce people to other kinds of beers. We took cues from what he was trying to do in the commercial beer business and what we were aspiring to make. So he introduced us to the taste of some of these beers that we had no clue about before they appeared on the shelves. Paul Friedman. No one here probably remembers who Paul Friedman is. Yes, Bill Ridgely does. He's from the Washington, D.C. area. I met him for the first time probably around 1980. He was an editor for the Washington Post. And he and a few other editors really took a liking. They discovered Zymergy magazine, and they were beer enthusiasts, and they really took a liking to what we were trying to achieve as home brewers and the organization AHA. And they helped us connect with brewers, particularly in the UK. It was through him that I was introduced to the CEO and president of Young's Brewery, John Young, and David Bruce, who founded the Firkin Brew Pubs in London. That was the original resurrection of the brew pub. And David Bruce and John Young came to our conferences, and they spoke about their experiences. And it was through those experiences, for example, David Bruce's talk about brew pubs, that people in the audience, just like here, were scratching their head and say, wait a minute, what a great idea. You make your beer here, and you serve it right here, directly to the customer. A completely new idea. It was illegal in most states. So the laws had to change, and they did. But it was through some of the connections and contributions of not only Paul Friedman, and his co-workers, Dan McCoubrey, who is no longer with us, but they actually founded BURP. Brewers United for Real Potables, the Washington, D.C., Maryland area homebrew club. And I remember myself going to a few of those crab feasts in the backyards of early members. So we were indebted to those guys. Stewart Harris. He worked in Boulder, Colorado at this time. He worked for a micro computer company back in the late 70s and early 80s. The word microbrewer had not come off of anybody's lips yet. And he took an interest in volunteering at the small brewery news editor, because we were hearing about breweries like the endeavors of Anchor Steam, but also of New Albion and Sierra Nevada and Boulder Beer and Cartwright Brewing out of Portland and a few others. There was about 5 or 6 small brewers. And he said, scratch his head over a beer one day, he said, I work for, I'm develop microcomputers. These small brewers are kind of like microbreweries. And he integrated that phrase into one of his stories, and it has stuck since then. So I credit Stewart Harris for inventing the term microbreweries. We are indebted to his contributions. Michael Jackson. One of the things he always liked to point out was that he'd never homebrewed, and he never would. He never wanted to make beer because he was a journalist. He wanted to keep his hands clean to that so he could be a little bit more objective as a journalist. And all of you know who he was, and the first time I met him was in 1981. I had heard his voice on Henry Weinhardt commercials because he was talking about Cascade hops and Henry Weinhardt's, and these are radio commercials that were ubiquitous at the time. And at the time I figured, where does this guy live? He must live in the United States somewhere, and somehow I tracked him down, got on the phone with him, and I said, would you come to our homebrewing event in Boulder, Colorado? And he said, sure, just pay my air ticket, I'll be there. And lo and behold, he came, we introduced ourselves, and we became friends immediately, and he became friends with many of you here in the audience and many other brewers and homebrewers throughout the world. Not only in his presentations and his writings, but he helped judge many, many early homebrew competitions. He was thoroughly involved and thoroughly loved what we were doing as homebrewers. Professor Michael Lewis, he first came to our conferences in 1982, 1983, and many more conferences after that. I just finished I interviewed him just a month ago about his early experiences as a professor of brewing science at UC Davis. And I asked him, what were you thinking when you came to Boulder, Colorado in 1982? I mean, we were a lot of people consider us a bunch of hippies from Boulder who had this funky little organization called the Homebrewers Association, had no clue whether we were serious or not. But they really put their faith in what we were doing. We were the only ones that were really doing it on a national scale. And he came, and I said, what were you thinking? Why did you come? And he said, as a professor of brewing science and with many students, that's part of my job. I had an obligation to reach out to the whatever brewing culture existed at that time, and see what was going on, and see if I could contribute. And he did contribute, and he continues to contribute. He dove in, assessed beer, judged homebrew competitions, figured out, I'm sure he learned what some of the problems we were encountering by tasting what we were tasting, and I'm sure it affected what his curriculum was and some of the things that he emphasized to his students. Charlie Madson is a co-founder of the American Homebrewers Association. We were both teachers at the time in Boulder in the 70s. He was a student of mine in my homebrew classes, and we drank too much homebrew. And we had this idea to start a newsletter, and then we drank more homebrew. Well, maybe a publication. Well, maybe a magazine. More homebrew. Well, maybe an organization called the American Homebrewers Association. Yeah, let's think about it. And we thought about it for a year, and we eventually started the American Homebrewers Association. And he was thoroughly involved for the first 2 years, and then he knew where this was going and how much work it was. He said, Charlie, keep it going. I'll help when I can, but I'm going to pursue my profession. He was a professional teacher at public schools in Longmont, Colorado. And we went on many adventures. We were inspired by our adventures. We experimented with going into the backcountry and how could we take homebrew. We experimented here with a golf cart. It worked. We walked in 5 miles and found the hot springs and drank homebrew for 3 days. Fritz Maytag, not a home brewer, but as you know, he resurrected the Anchor Brewing Company in 1969 when he bought it. It was a failing brewery. And his expertise and his experience was invaluable, gave an invaluable perspective, not only to home brewers, but to people in the audience that in those days were home brewers that wanted to become microbrewers. And he was at the 1982 conference, the 1983 conference, the 1986 conference, and at that 1986 conference, he's making a point here about quality. He's putting on he looked like a hazard suit, but he's just like, quality was important, microbiology, quality, keep it clean. And he got dressed up and put a shower cap on and a plastic robe on to make the point, keep it clean. Grosvenor Merle Smith, another Boulder person. He was vice president of the American Home Brewers Association for 4 or 5 years. And I can't say enough about Grosvenor. It was, we started with a national homebrew competition back in the early days, and we were struggling with how are we going to evaluate beer? And we dove into this whole idea of evaluating beer, assessing beer, learning about how to assess beer. And Grosvenor took charge of our earliest programs about evaluating beer off flavors and aromas, gave lectures, and this program that he developed was the predecessor of what later became the Beer Judge Certification Program. He gave many presentations at the early conferences, and people were just like you, just wanting to learn about diacetyl and dimethyl sulfide and funky flavors and aromas, what they tasted like, what they smelled like, and where they came from. And there was very little information in those days, very little information. And we networked with a lot of people. Here we are at one of our regional conferences. This was in Ohio. That gentleman on Grosvenor's left was Morton Mealgard, and he chaired the committee and was in charge of developing the flavor wheel, the beer flavor wheel. And Morton worked for Stroh Brewing Company at the time. And so we established a relationship, Grosvenor did and I did, and we all did, establish relationships with professionals who did evaluation as a job. And we learned from them and translated it into information that was accessible to home brewers. So I can't say enough about Grosvenor's contributions. David Miller. How many know who David Miller is? Yes, there's a number of people. David Miller became the 1981 Home Brewer of the Year. And what was so special about that was that he won it with an all-grain beer. Unheard of. It rocked the home brewing world, and retailers and malt extract manufacturers were very concerned that an all-grain beer was now going to represent what home brewing was all about. And I have all the respect for quality malt extract beers. You can't tell the difference, but my personal philosophy is if you want to get more engaged and brew more complex beers, you need to use grains, and sometimes all grains, to develop some of these very special styles. But the quality of a malt extract, I'm not up here to bash it because it's great. David proved that homebrewers could make an all-grain beer and win the top award in a homebrew competition. That was a big, big paradigm shift in the history of our hobby. David also wrote a book in our classic brewing style series called Continental Pilsner. He won with a Pilsner lager style beer, which was also very difficult to brew in those days. He was a teacher at the time. He became a professional brewer. He with the Blackstone Brewing in Nashville, Tennessee, for 20 years, I believe he was a professional brewer. So he was one of the original home brewer of the years that eventually became professional. And there were quite a few of them, and he was the first. Bill Owens. Bill Owens was a pioneer in brew pub. He was a home brewer initially. He started Buffalo Bill's Brew Pub, the first brew pub in California, more or less. Mendocino and him opened up about the same time. But he had amateur brewers. He bought Amateur Brewers publication. He published Home Fermenters Digest. He published American Brewer. Now he's director of American Distilling Institute. He no longer owns his brew pub, but he was constantly in the news and somebody that we followed, and an inspiration for a lot of people, particularly with how he popularized the whole concept of pumpkin beer and putting other spices, basil beer and other spices in his beer at his brew pub in Hayward, California. Ron Siebel. Can't say enough about Ron Siebel, who is the owner with his brother of the Siebel Institute and J.E. Siebel's and Son. He was at the 1982 conference, 83, and many, many more conferences after that, and shared his knowledge and investigated what this whole homebrewing movement was all about, and how he could help and how Siebel could help evolve their curriculum to help homebrewers and microbrewers get the information at the level in which they would understand. So Ron came to our conferences and judged homebrew, participated in the celebrations. He loved beer, and was thoroughly involved and engaged in what we were doing and helping us out. So a shout out to Ron. Professor Surfite. He made many appearances in the earlier days, but there was none more memorable than 1989, when he appeared on stage with Brewly a child, his wife, and his 6 kids. And that was a pretty memorable, that was at Oldenburg conference, and he would appear and to answer questions as part of the program. It was a fun time, and Professor Surfite was indeed quite a character. I haven't seen him in a long time, but Dave Wills of Fresh Hops. He came to our original conferences and figured out we were really enthusiastic about hops, but we couldn't get them. And he established the company Fresh Hops, which established access to good fresh hops for home brewers and homebrew shops so that we could have them. And he also sold root cuttings. So early shots of him bringing all these hops, which we loved to see, because in those days, for many of us, it was the first time we'd ever seen green hops. Before that, it was brown hops that were crispy. But Dave was an icon, and he still is involved with Fresh Hops, and he also has a small brewery in Oregon. 1982 to 1990, Terry Farendorf, a brewer, one of the first female craft professional brewers, one of the first female craft brewers that went to the Siebel Institute. She would come to our early homebrew conferences and teach us what she knew. And here she's giving a lesson in how to work with slants of yeast and culture yeast. George Fix. George was somebody we really missed. He's written a few books, Vienna and our Brewing Classic Beer Style Series, Vienna and Oktoberfest. He's also written Principles of Brewing Science, Analysis of Brewing Techniques. What he did was take the highly technical information that he could understand and translate it into words that were relevant to home brewers. The technical and the engineering aspects. One of the things you wouldn't want to be anywhere close to him when he was giving a presentation, especially close to that stick, because he would work up a sweat within 5 minutes, and he would be whipping that thing around, and you couldn't help but absorb every word he said because he was so enthusiastic. We would walk back and forth in the front of the room, and he'd get all worked up, and you just absorb that passion. Terry Foster, he wrote the first book of our classic beer style series called Pale Ale, and then that was revised. But Terry was from Connecticut, I believe, and he shared, originally from the UK, but he shared his information and really dove into helping the AHA emerge with really good quality information about British ales. Jim Homer, there he is right there. Jim Homer and Pat Baker. at the 1989 conference. These two guys co-chaired the original, I guess, foundations of the beer judge certification program. Both of them worked tirelessly in getting that off the ground and getting some semblance of structure and ability to reach out and establish a meaningful program. This is not a great picture of Dan Listerman, but that is Dan Listerman on to the side. But Dan was from Missouri, and he developed Phil's Lauder system. He took, in the early days, we didn't have Lauder systems. There was, you couldn't get stainless steel stuff. And he came up with a plastic Lauder system that was affordable and worked and made mashing much more accessible to home brewers. So he represents a lot of other people that were innovators in that period of time. Here's another innovator, Dave Logston. Now you have White Labs and Y Yeast, but Dave was the first one. He went from test tube presentations in the early days and slants, and he took his passion for microbiology and developed a company called Y Yeast, the Smack Packs. And that was revolutionized the access that we as homebrewers had to yeast. But before then, it was all dried yeast, and it was crappy yeast. Most of it was crappy yeast. And we made okay beer. But once we had access to fresh cultures, live cultures, liquid cultures at affordable prices, before that, minimum $100 a slant. Minimum. If you could find it. So Dave, I credit him with exploring those avenues. Michael Matuszewski from Minnesota. There's an article by him that appeared in Zymergy around 1989, thereabouts. But he was one of the original scratch brewers. He had a farm in Minnesota. He grew his own hops, all organic farm, berries, fruit orchard, brewed in wooden barrels, wild fermentations, Belgian-style beers, in a time where you could hardly buy commercial varieties, let alone information about these things. It was incredible what he introduced to us in those days. He single-handedly brewed many wood barrel-aged wild fermentations, 2 different beers for our 1990 conference. It was a commemorative beer. One home brewer made all the commemorative beer for our 1990 conference. Of course, there weren't 3,000 people at that conference, but there were several hundred, and those beers were exceptional. One was a raspberry sour gueuze lambic, and one was a brown ale with fruit in it as well. Rodney Morris from Texas, he introduced us to the idea of a recirculating infusion mash system. He developed that and sold it commercially, and he gave us another perspective on another way to mash, the RIMS system. He was, in my mind, I might have got this information wrong, but he was the first guy I can remember. I credit him with introducing the RIMS system to home brewing. Randy Mosher, who is another icon. I don't know if he's in this room, but boy, he is. I guess what epitomizes what his contribution is in his book, Radical Brewing. Whether it's beer culture, brewing, fermentation, weird ingredients, traditional ingredients, ingredients from other parts of the world, experimentation. He's kind of like the Sam Calagione of home brewing, but on a much more extreme level. His contributions and his participation at these conferences has been invaluable over the years, and he has been a part of this for many, many years. Greg Noonan, he passed away a number of years ago, but I met him in about 1984 when we had a regional conference in Boston, Massachusetts. And he came up to me. I didn't know who he was. He's Greg Noonan. He's a home brewer. He came up to me and gave me a shoebox with about 100 pages of typed information. He says, I wrote this book. I wrote this, and maybe you guys be interested in seeing it, publishing it. Well, it turned out to be that manuscript was the manuscript for brewing lager beer. And I remember I was the technical editor, I was the editor. We were pretty small in those days, and that was the first book we published. And it was through one of our regional conferences that he came up and introduced himself as an enthusiast. And if in those days, it was the first book about, a technical book about lager brewing. And there were many people who would call themselves Noonanites because they were followers of Greg and what he did. He eventually opened up the Vermont Pub and Brewery in Burlington, Vermont. He passed away about 8 or 9 years ago. But he was so helpful and in attendance to so many of these conferences and shared his information so many times. I can't say enough about Greg Noonan. Another person that passed away was Bill Pfeiffer, one of the first to achieve the highest status in beer judge certification program. But in general, he was an all-around great guy. He kind of put Michigan and Michigan homebrewers on the map. He was their front guy. And in those days, and his enthusiasm was so contagious. You know, one of the things that he's best known for having said was, "Man, I love this hobby." You know, you couldn't put it any better. Where are we here? Oh, Alberta Rager, homebrew shop owner out of Kansas City, served as advisory board on the AHA in the early days, and also made that connection between us as homebrewers and retail shops and the communications and developing you know, standards and quality presentations and such. She was really involved, and her husband, Jackie Rager, was instrumental in developing some of the thinking about how could home brewers kind of dial in the bitterness of their beer, and how you can take the alpha acid content and figure out a formula to kind of calculate or estimate how bitter your beer was going to be. Randy Reed from Wisconsin. He was a real ale geek, and in those days, in the early 80s, mid-80s, real ale was all new to us. And he took a deep dive and shared his knowledge, not only at regional conferences, but at our national conferences. And I can tell you, his real ale was as good as any I had in England. And he introduced us to beer in the wood, hand pumps, etc. in those very, very early days. You know, this could have been one of the dozen hand pumps in all the USA in those days. Darrell Richmond from Seattle. He wrote the book Bock Beer for us, beer style series. But he took a deep dive into malt, and because Bock beers were a lot about malt, and he opened up this whole world of actually brewing with 100% Munich malt and getting beers that were malt accented, and took us in that direction. Russ Scheer, he won Homebrewer of the Year award in 1985. He became brewmaster at the Wink Hoop Brewery. He became one of the innovators, not only in homebrewing, but in the industry. There's an award named after him. The Brewers Association at the Craft Brewers Conference is the Russell Scheer Award for Innovation. But he started out as homebrewing, and he shared so much with us. There he is at the 1985 conference getting his Homebrewer of the Year award, and there he is talking with Fritz Maytag, sharing stories and information. But he represents the early innovation that we were and achievements that we were all trying to do. Ken Schramm. Ken just gave a talk earlier this morning. He took us in directions of honey and mead that none of us have explored before. He has been on the forefront and a pioneer for many, many years, and he has shared not only his passion for honey, but his passion for mead through many, many presentations over the decades here at this Homebrewers Conference, and has had a lot of fun doing it as well. Only got a few more here. Ray Spangler, 1987 Homebrewer of the Year. He brewed the Claude of Zeppeli commemorative beer for the 1989 conference, the commemorative beer for the Homebrewers Conference. Single-handedly brewed it for everybody. But he introduced us to the Belgian twist of putting coriander and spices that replicated some of the Belgian beers that we were enjoying, whipped beers and stuff. First time. And he became a professional brewer for a short period of time, but he continued to show up for many many conferences. Dave Welker, a Boulder person, he's a dentist, but in his spare time he volunteered, and he was the director of the National Homebrew Competition for many of those early years and helped develop systems and organize those competitions for all of us as we grew. And Jean-Xavier Guignard, he wrote the book in the beer style series called Lambic. Let me tell you a story about Jean. I was a judge in one of the first rounds of the homebrew competition back in the 80s, and I judged a lambic beer that just blew me away. It was a cherry lambic. And it went on to win an award. I judged the first category. And I wrote a note. I said, whoever this is, I want to know who you are, because I want to ask you how you did this. And after the competition, I got an email. And he said, I'm John. I'm a student at UC Davis. Now he's a professor. Not at UC Davis, but he's a professor of brewing science somewhere. And what he did was begin our journey in the real world of lambic beers and culturing Brettanomyces yeast. He sent me 2 slants, a Brettanomyces bruxellensis and a slant of Brettanomyces lambicus. And I cobbled together a recipe and successfully brewed lambic style. It wasn't true lambic, but it definitely had the character. And I wrote about it, and he eventually wrote the book Lambic, which will soon be available electronically again. It'll be reprinted in an electronic format, I understand. But it was a first English book, English language book about lambic and some of the technical aspects of brewing lambic that ever appeared. So that was his contribution. Now, I just have a few more photographs, just historic moments, not necessarily stars. These are just historic moments. This is the original office of the American Homebrewers Association, a back patio of my rental house that I rented. These are all volunteer workers getting ready for probably a beer festival or a homebrew conference. And you can see this. Our state-of-the-art was we had paper envelopes for our inboxes in those days. And this must have been a few months later. We actually had cardboard boxes in the upper top. That was the state of affairs there. Gretchen Graff is AHA's, American Homebrewers Association's first #1 member. A woman from Boulder, Colorado. These are the judges, a few of the judges at the first American Homebrewers Association national competition. The way we judged in that very first time, it was on the beer quality and also the presentation. So they went around and interviewed all the 26 entries, talked to them, and tasted their beers. And there they are on the front steps of the church we were at, the ex-church, trying to figure out who was going to win. And that was Homebrewer of the Year #1, Tim Mead, a pharmacist in Boulder, Colorado, and that's Mary Beth Millard, Homebrewer of the Year, the second year. Notable people that came to our early conference: Professor Kieninger of Weihenstephan, professor of the program at University of Munich, Weihenstephan, came in 1982 to the American Homebrewers Association conference. George Zenkrath, the director of Dohmann's Institute in Munich, Germany, he came to the 1982 conference. Homebrewers. So these people were coming in from all over the world to figure out what we were about to endeavor on as homebrewers and see how serious we were. There's Gordon Bowker, who at the time was one of the founders of Starbuck and also announcing a new beer at the 1983 conference, American Homebrewers Association conference, a beer that was going to be called Red Hook. And that's Matthew Reich on the left, who was the founder of New Amsterdam Brewing, that came up with the initial idea of contract brewing, before Jim Cook did, and before Pete Schlossberg with Pete's Wicked Ale did. He was the first. Memorable moments, that was the 10-year anniversary. I got roasted and I got pied at the event. So no, getting pied once is enough at a conference. Doesn't have to happen again. I made many different types of entries during the conference, just before the awards of the National Homebrew Competition this year. I think togas were real in because Animal House was the popular movie. So I came in a toga and got carried in by notable homebrewers. This was a 1989 Homebrewers Conference. I belayed about 50 feet from the roof and came in on my tuxedo with a glass of beer in hand above the homebrew crowd. This is pretty notable. All those people at that table are homebrewers of the year. 1981, 1983, 84, 85, 86, 87. Ray Spangler, Byron Birch, Russ Scheer, Dwayne Lee Saxton, Nancy Vineyard, and David Miller, one of our earlier conferences. Maltose Falcons always had a presence and always have a presence. One of the original homebrew club of America, in a sense. That's John Meyer, the brewer at Rogue Brewing in the center, and with his cohorts. Fred, myself, Byron, and Greg Noonan celebrating the 15th anniversary. This is an early panel at a Homebrewers Conference of professional brewers, homebrewers turned professional, people that I can recognize there: Russ Scheer, Wayne Wianen. Jeff Liebisch, second from the left, is the founder of New Belgium Brewing Company. These people were all originally homebrewers. This is a pretty notable one. That person in the forefront there is Professor Solomon Katz from the University of Pennsylvania. And in the 1980s, he introduced the idea that agriculture was begun because people wanted to grow barley in order to make beer. So he was the first person. In those days, it was making headlines in newspapers all over the country. But he was the first that I can recall that had done the research about the early man 5,000 years ago, going from hunter-gatherer to farmer. And the reason was beer. 1986, a bunch of us authors got together, and legendary 1984, we gave all the international guests AHA underwear that had "I love AHA" on their underwear, and I just met a guy from Germany just last year that said he still has that in his own. Celebrating with giant mugs of beer, and this, I made an entrance in 1985 on an elephant. You can ask me later about how I found an elephant in 1985. It wasn't easy before the internet, but I did. And so I came in there, and that's how I will leave you right now. So.
So as Charlie mentioned, he's been digitizing, categorizing, going through and just labeling all of this great content, footage, photographs from the 40 years of homebrewing. He says he's hoping to make those available by some means online, I assume through AHA or BA websites. He's also doing those interviews with the pioneers of craft brewing. He had told us he wasn't sure if those would take the forms of a giant documentary or be posted individually, but regardless, the plan is to make those available for everybody to use for further and future research, as well as just celebration of where we've been, where we're going as homebrewers. So once again, shout out to Charlie, shout out to AHA and the BA for loaning us those awesome pictures, and Charlie just taking that good hour of his time to kind of show us the past, lead us to the future. All right, guys. Till the next episode, chop for chop, brew for brew.
All right, can you hear me? I'm all mic'd up, so I got all these wires coming on. I was thinking I'm a wireman. I got to go to work for Wireman Malt or something. I don't know.